Hello and good afternoon. It's Brandon White, your local journalism initiative hire for MBC Radio News here in the Ronge, Saskatchewan. Today we're going to dip a little bit into the pre-COVID-19 archives to celebrate the recent win of a major award by a homegrown documentary, and to look a little more deeply at the types of conversations that came about after the screenings of this powerful documentary, We Will Stand Up. Congratulations to writer and director Tasha Hubbard, the production team that includes George Hupka, Bonnie Thompson, and many others, and just everyone who touched this important documentary, of course including the Boushie family. We Will Stand Up is a documentary that explores the 2016 shooting death of then 22-year-old Colton Boushie, a Red Pheasant First Nations member, on a farm near Biggar, Saskatchewan by a man named Gerald Stanley. In case you are somehow new to this case, Gerald Stanley, the defendant, testified that he thought his farm homestead was being invaded upon, that his ATV was being stolen, and that's why he acted. After firing 2 warning shots, his third shot was in the back of Colton Boushie's head. It was a 1 in a million hang fire, we're told. Gerald Stanley was acquitted of murder, though he would later plead guilty to unlawful storage of an unrestricted firearm, a charge that cost him 3,000 Canadian dollars. For comparison, a GoFundMe page was created to cover the legal costs and otherwise incurred by the Stanley family. It raised $200,000. Boushie's death, the trial, and documentary inflamed racial tensions in Saskatchewan. Following the not guilty verdict, the Boushie family sought changes to the judicial system that they thought contributed to the case. Most notably, to preemptory challenges that they thought were used to exclude Indigenous voices from the jury. The film has won many awards. Best Canadian Feature at Hot Docs, the Colin Lowe Award for Best Canadian Documentary, Audience Choice Award for Best Feature Film at the Imagine Native Film and Arts Festival, 2020 Vancouver Film Critics Best Canadian Documentary, and now the 2020 Ted Rogers Best Feature-Length Documentary Award. If you would like to see the full movie We Will Stand Up, there's a link to the National Film Board in the description. Amidst a larger international climate of protests and militarized reactions to these protests, it's important that Canadians consider our own historical context and possible systemic racism. The case continues to be controversial and to inspire dialogue around race, politics, and justice.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you to the Academy for recognizing the film in this way. I want to start by acknowledging Colton and his family. And this is a film that was hard to make because we never lost sight of the fact that this shouldn't have happened. This situation shouldn't have happened, and Colton should still be here. And these acts of injustice that continue to happen, you know, it's unfortunate that we're at this time and at this place, and these films still need to be made. So I want to acknowledge them and acknowledge the difficult and brave decision they made to be a part of this film.
It's really difficult to watch the movie. I don't usually watch. I left for a good part of it because it was really hard to be there and witness it. As I said at the beginning, I sat through the trial, and I've been practicing law for 20 years now. A large part of that practice was done in courtrooms just like that. I was a criminal law lawyer for a long time. I still am. And it was really hard to sit there and to give the family hope when during the process itself I didn't feel hopeful. There were questions that should have been asked that weren't. The family doesn't have standing in the courtroom as a victim if you are represented by the Crown. So the Crown is supposed to present the case to the best of their ability. And to watch a case fall apart and to provide hope to a family when there wasn't much hope at all was difficult. The issue wasn't ultimately inside the courtroom either. It started the day Colton was killed. And the RCMP, we have a lawsuit against them for how they handled or mishandled the evidence. You've seen in the movie, the SUV that Colton was in, it was left out in the rain. Evidence washed away in the vehicle, outside of the vehicle. They could have easily put a tarp over the vehicle, but they didn't. There were a lot of mistakes that were made in the investigation. And I think that's because at the beginning it was treated like a property crime instead of a murder. The focus was more on what was taken. And as I said in the film, there was all the stereotypes that emerged. And we still see that today. I don't read the comments. I tell the family not to read the comments about the movie or comments and articles because they're still filled with hate. And that's because people don't want to see the truth. And that truth goes back to colonization, and I'm sure Mylan will talk about that because that's his area, but when a system is built, a system, like a criminal justice system, when it's built to oppress a people, that's what it does. And when you point out that that is what it's doing in cases like this, people get upset because you're challenging a status quo, you're challenging a system that's always been there and that wants to keep putting Indigenous people in jail, that keeps failing Indigenous people from seeking justice. And that is what the criminal justice system does. That's what it was meant to do, and that's what it's still doing. And sometimes it's really difficult to work within that system. So after the trial, I became very upset. I think we were all angry. I thought of my children. I thought of all of the Indigenous people who've been treated poorly and badly in the system, and I spoke out. And there were a lot of times where I wasn't very popular, but that's part of what it means to stand up, is to take a step forward, put yourself in front and not really worry what people think. But it was difficult, I must say it was, for everybody. Debbie currently is taking classes in North Battleford. She's upgrading, so she couldn't be here tonight, otherwise she would have been here. She usually comes when the film is shown around Saskatchewan, but she couldn't. But she does send her greetings. And it's been extremely difficult for the family throughout this journey because they have to grieve in public and they have to, they really have no closure. There was no happy ending to this. There is no happy ending. Colton is dead. There's a man who was acquitted. There was a bad police investigation. There is no happy ending. That is why we have to keep speaking out, seeking what we can. The province had the power to appeal. They could have appealed, but they didn't. Instead, they held a press conference. And in my 20 years of practicing law, I have never seen a press conference held regarding a decision not to appeal. There were so many things in this case that I witnessed, that I observed, that I've never seen in my entire life practicing law. And it was so blatant, the racism was just so bold, and it was so wrong. So I'm glad that Tasha made this movie, because it shows the other side of the story. People believe what they read in media, and a lot of times in this case, in other cases, media is wrong. This is the other side. So I'm glad that people watch it to see what the truth was and to see how this family was treated. So what we're seeking ultimately is justice, so that other families don't have to go through what the Boushies went through. We'd like a royal commission, we'd like an inquiry, so that people can see the truth. We have a lawsuit against the RCMP. But ultimately, this journey is so that our children, like Juan and Oskaya, those two young men in this film, so they don't have to be scared to walk in their own territory. And I know that there is still fear to go certain places in our province without fear. And that has to change. This is our land, this is our territory, this is where we come from. And that's why we have to stand up and say no. No more racism. So if you see acts of racism, if you see things that aren't right, if you're Native or non-Native, you have a duty. I challenge you to speak up, to stand up for those who can't necessarily speak up for themselves, to stand up for what is right, so that people don't have to go through what this family went through. And I thank everybody for coming and watching. I know it's a difficult film to watch. It means so much to the family. It means so much to Colton. Thank you for remembering him and for coming out and supporting the family, even though they're not here. They know that it was screened here, and I'll tell them there was quite a large audience, and they received a lot of support, because that is what keeps them going in their journey for justice, is people like you. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass the mic on to Mylan.
Just want to remind everybody that some of you received some paper and some pens. Those are for those that want to make sure that their questions are going to be sent over. If some of you are not comfortable with speaking in public, put some questions down, and we have some of our young men there that'll scoop them up, come and give them to me, or come and give them to me personally. But we're gonna have each of our guests, as I said before, speak 5 minutes or longer. It's up to you. Then we'll open it up for questions afterwards.
Thank you. My name is Mylan Tootoosis. I'm from Poundmaker Indian Reserve, just 40 clicks west of North Battleford. So I grew up in that area. That's where I still live. My horses are on Poundmaker, my garden's there. And I'm also doing my PhD at the University of Saskatchewan. And I remember when this happened, I was driving down to visit some family in the US. And I remember getting a call. My mom called me and she said somebody was shot. I was like, what? Who was shot? And she was asking if anyone heard information, because literally when our community in that area heard a farmer shot somebody, it went still, because nobody knew who the person was. No one knew details. And it was like spine chilling, because everyone was calling to check on each other. Where's so-and-so? Where's your brother? Where are you right now? And all we knew was that somebody had a flat tire and went onto a farm and was shot. details came out that really portrayed and highlighted a narrative that, in my mind, when we look at the trial, if you go back and read it, if you look at some of the testimonies, in particular the testimony of the forensic investigator from Ottawa that had to look at the handgun, logically, Gerald Stanley shot Colton. Like, just logically. And if you just look at it from that logical frame of mind, it doesn't take a scholar, it doesn't take a genius. Just to look at the details of that case, things didn't add up and weren't adding up in the courtroom. And he didn't even get a manslaughter charge. He didn't even get anything like that. He was acquitted, and it was really a challenging time for a lot of our people, because we also know of stories where things happened like this before, where there's oral histories of things happening like this before. There's even histories up here near this area, Big River, out west a little bit. There's stories there of instances happening like this before. And it's a repeat pattern. And I really like what Alvin says on the documentary Outside the Courthouse, is we can't, racism isn't okay, it's not good. We can't pass this down to the next generation. And at the same time, when we expose the injustice, when we call Nuniawak settlers, when we call non-Indigenous people out, we're not preaching hate. We're just telling our own history. We're just speaking about what we observe take place in our history of where these tensions come from. Because these are our territories and our lands. We know the names of the sacred places. We know where our ancestors are buried. Indigenous roots, our Nehewak roots, will always be deepest here. And all I ask for and all I pray for is that relationship's respected, and that we could come together in peace and diplomacy and begin to resolve these problems. And that requires certain restitutions, that requires certain freedoms for Indigenous people to have, to be able to traverse our landscape freely, to be able to hunt and fish, to be able to acquire our land back and maintain our culture and our language the way our ancestors did. And there's a lot of land out there. Why do they want it all? Everything. We were just talking today about, even the trap lines now up here. They're coming after the trap lines. They're coming out of the right of way in terms of the waterfronts now. But that's your people's land. That's your Muslim and Kukum's land. And it's important to maintain those relationships and speak to that also, in addition to trying to address the injustice and the racism that's taking place. Because when we talk this way about colonialism, decolonization, we're not trying to ruffle feathers. We're not trying to promote hate. We're just telling the truth of history and how we see things unfolding in our worldview, in our frame of mind, and how we think. So it's a very unsettling conversation. It's a heavy conversation for our generation today, and for the generation before us in particular, who had to deal with very physical forms of trauma in residential school. But my generation, our generation, the Oskaya kids, the young people, we weren't in residential school. We didn't go. And now you're hearing the truth come out. Now you hear them to ask questions. Now you hear them saying, this doesn't make sense. Certain things don't add up. And we have to foster that inquiry. And all the young people need to do the research. Like I said today in our workshop, ask your Muslims and Kukums about your language, about your stories, about the history, the place names, because that's where it all starts. Reculturalizing and learning our language is going to fuel our decolonization. Like I said in the documentary at the protest, to tell the story of what took place, to fuel us, to give us energy and inspire us, to speak about Colton in that way, because he exposed a lot of truth. And it's really hard for Saskatchewan and the legal system and settler colonialism to cover it up again, because we all seen it. My generation and younger, the Gerald Stanley trial, there was just like a little pinpoint, an option where we were all thinking maybe there will be justice. It's like a little sliver of hope. Maybe this is a chance for them to do things right for once. And when you got the non-guilty verdict, it went out the window. That's why you hear young people say, in particular on the prairie and even now across Canada, reconciliation's dead. right? For me, it died that day when I was driving back to the courtroom after they read the verdict. And now you look at the media today, and this clash is still taking place with industry. Now on the West Coast in BC, Canada, the RCMP are trying to push the LNG pipeline through traditional territory, creating conflict. It all boils down to that land use, and that assumed power and authority over who we are and our people to be able to determine how we're going to live and function on our land. And that's not fair. That's abuse. That's bullying. Why is it we talk about trying to resolve bullying in our schools when the whole system is designed to bully us as Indigenous people? When are we going to have that conversation? Because we can't resolve this little microcosm of the bigger symptom. So that's what I do with my work. And Jade being my sister, in multiple ways, my late father adopting her as a daughter, and my first cousin falling in love with her later on and marrying her. She's my sister in 2 different ways now. I really chose to be present in that courtroom and be present in that space, and it was really up close and personal with the energy of colonialism, the toxicity of it, the violence of it. It was almost as if we were being shamed just for expecting truth, just for expecting justice. We're shamed online. You see the comments. Some people don't even read the comments online anymore. And it's almost as if people paint a nice picture that everything's okay in rural Saskatchewan, that we're just humble farmers trying to make a living. But if you just smudge that, if you just remove that little layer, that racism's there, and it comes out very aggressively. We didn't bring guns to protests, the RCMP did. We didn't call for violence. Farmers with firearms on Facebook did. They said to stockpile guns. We didn't do that. Indigenous people didn't say that. We called for peace and diplomacy. We even asked for our people to pray for everybody, even the families. And if that doesn't speak to treaty and peace and diplomacy, I don't know what else does. Because time and time again, we draw on our compassion and our love for the land and for everyone. And we see that. We see that in Debbie. We see that in the family, that this resiliency is always present. So there's a little bit of truth here. There's a little bit of honesty in terms of honoring and paying homage to the resiliency that's taking place, to respect that, foster that, and let it fuel you too. Because every 4 years it seems something happens in Canada. And are we going to be awake and woke enough to be able to get our act together to say no in the next 4 years? And that's the timeline. Every 4 years something flares up. What's coming down the pipeline? We don't know yet. But are we awake enough to be able to stand up together and mobilize together? So I wanted to just say that, and thanks for having me here today. I'm really honored to be here and share some knowledge with you, particularly youth today. I know some of you have questions to ask, so I'll pass the mic over. Thank you.
Okay, well, good evening, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I grew up off of Highway 55 between Shellbrook and Big River. But my mom was from Ataku and here is Okemasis. This is the 4th time I've watched this film, and each time I learned something. And so I highly recommend that when you have the opportunity to view it again. And tonight, as I reflected on the messages and the analysis in the film, I was reminded, and I was busily looking up the various lawyers and judges involved in high profile cases in the last 20 years or so. And in particular, I was thinking back to the murder of Pamela George, a 28-year-old Indigenous woman who was brutally raped and murdered by 2 white men in Regina in 1996, and then the resulting trial, and then the resulting sentencing of those 2 men. And then I was thinking about the rape of, the sexual assault and rape of a 12-year-old First Nations out of Tisdale by 3 young white men And then the subsequent, when I listened to that trial, that's going back now 20 years, and the reporting of it, I was shocked and dismayed at the inability of what I felt the prosecutor to defend that young girl. And also the way in which the media represented and reported on that case in particular. And when I think back, so both the legal system and the media collaborate to basically undermine the dignity, the humanity, and the human rights of Indigenous people. And I recall back in 1990, during the Oka crisis, listening to the media and being alarmed at the very biased reporting on what was happening in that territory. I'm an educator. I'm a teacher. I teach anti-racist education. I've been doing this for my entire career, over 30 years. And at that time in 1990, I was still young as an educator. I went to a more senior colleague, someone I thought involved in media studies, to ask about if he could come and do a presentation on bias in the media. And I remember the look that he gave me. He looked at me like, bias? Are you kidding me? We're not biased in the media. He was not even relating to that request. And so that has been my experience in terms of education. And so again, with this trial, again, I was just deeply concerned about the inability of the legal system, and particularly the prosecutor, who's supposed to be there to defend and defend the victim. So just last week I was invited to, so there is a lot of changes that need to happen, and I believe in education. Last week I was invited by a few faculty to the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. And they wanted to consult with me and my colleague, Dr. Sheila McLean, to discuss how to introduce a course in anti-racism, a required course for in law education. And this is in 2020, that that law school is finally considering a course in anti-racist education. And what I learned at that meeting is that there's only one other college of law in the country that has just recently introduced a course in anti-racism. So I think that that's part of the message that comes out of the film here, that we do need education, and it's not just education for Indigenous people, but education for us all. And I've been working on a film as well on racism in education. And that film should be coming out in the next few weeks. And I remember as I've been working on it in collaboration with the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, I've been a little bit apprehensive about how this film might be received, especially because we're so accustomed to seeing education as innocent. But after the film came out, this film, I felt like it would be a good complementary to calling for the need for education to examine racism in the past and in the present. And so that's what I've been doing, supporting graduate students to develop their own critical race analysis. And so thanks again for having me.
First, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. I think that I'm really glad, and I want to thank you for welcoming, all four of us are not from this land. And I want to thank you for welcoming us here and letting us be part of a process here in Ronge. And for me, being on this land is important. That I'll get to this a little bit, but I don't really feel like I'm Indigenous to anywhere, but it's this land of rock and lake and trees that feel most like home to me. And I've been in different versions of this land across what we call Canada, and there is a sense of home on this kind of land for me. So thank you for welcoming us. My name is Rhonda Rosenberg, and as Simon said before, I work for the Multicultural Council of Saskatchewan. We do anti-racism work all year, but in March we have a focus, and we were able to get some funding that lets us do a little bit more, because March 21st is the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And so this event comes as part of stuff that we're doing across the province. And for me, I was born in Toronto to parents also born in Toronto, but to my grandparents came from Eastern Europe. And we are settlers, and we are settlers like many of those who came, who really had no clue about the dispossession of people that was happening here. They were fleeing their own persecution. And I know this is true for lots of people, but then they were taught that this land was there to be taken. And this is huge unlearning for a lot of people of European descent who have come here. It's very big unlearning that my parents are just learning that people of their generation were pretty much universally, Indigenous people of their generation were sent to residential school. This is very new for them in the last couple of years. And so there is so much work to be done around understanding the people and the Indigenous rights and the very long and many-phased history of harms and of resistances and of incredible resiliences that have meant that, I mean, in this place, language is still alive here. And in other parts of the space that we call spiritual practices have remained very alive. And I think that those are things that, while we're dealing with racism, we also need to remember those acts of resistance and acts of resilience as we look to rebalancing. At UNCAS, we talk about 4 types of racism, and when we watch the film and when I've listened to the other folks on the panel talk, we can see examples. When we talk about cultural racism, those are the big stereotypes we don't even know when we're learning. When I first heard, when we were first learning about this story of this case, and I thought, what would make Gerald Stanley pick up a gun instead of a phone? And I thought, it's fear. He's learned to be afraid. He's learned that Indigenous men are scary. Young Indigenous people are scary. Because you know what? At the same time this was going on, I was hearing from other friends of identifying as white who grew up in rural Saskatchewan, who said, we got drunk and drove around and drove into people's farmyards all the time. And we got help when we did that. No one was hurt. We got the help we were looking for. Maybe they got a ride home if they were too drunk to drive, but probably they were just allowed to drive. So that's the big picture of the cultural stereotypes, the racism, that go into people's minds and hearts and let them do individual racist acts like that. We see very clearly some of the systemic racism, both with the way the RCMP handled the evidence, the horrendous way they treated Debbie Baptiste when they went to her home. This is not how any mother should be treated. The way that the criminal law system worked. All of those are systemic racism. We see internalized racism because this is something important. That white people are taught to believe in our superiority, just as much as people who are made into victims by white supremacy and racism are taught to believe in inferiority. It's our big, big job to root out those ideas of superiority. And I think that if we weren't dealing with that, we would not have a dead young man. And so we see all examples of all the aspects of all those forms of racism playing out in this story. And it's up to all of us to take action as individuals and collectively to make sure that we change our systems, our cultures, and our own ideas and our interactions so that we're able to move forward together with genuinely respectful, balanced communities that are healthy. Thank you very much.
So there's some questions that were sent around. I'll answer two that I chose to answer. The first question is, why didn't they have a native in the jury? Each side had so many preemptory challenges, and preemptory challenges mean that they can choose not to have a juror sit in the jury based on just looking at them. So you see in the movie that one Indigenous juror who was challenged. Well, every single Indigenous juror who stood there before the court that day was challenged. So that's how it ended up with an all-white jury and no Indigenous jurors. But the preemptory challenges are not gone. So that's one positive change that was made as a result of the family's advocacy, is that there are no more preemptory challenges in the selection of a jury. And the second question is, the evidence was so poor, it was terrible. Why wasn't the evidence reviewed and appealed? And then I think it says an inquiry. So the government of Saskatchewan chose not to appeal the verdict of not guilty. Instead, they had a press conference, which is what I said. In my opinion, there were grounds to appeal based on the evidence, especially the gun evidence. There were two witnesses who were called on the defense, and these people were what we call lay witnesses. So they weren't expert witnesses, but their testimony seemed to be given the same weight as the experts in the trial. And that would have been something that I think could have been appealed, but it wasn't. Instead, the government chose not to appeal, and that ends the criminal case, because if they choose not to appeal, there's no further step. Like there's Queen's Bench, the trial, and then you appeal it to the Court of Appeal. Well, they declined to appeal it. After the Court of Appeal, of course, there's the Supreme Court, but you have to go through all those steps, through all the court levels, and they chose not to appeal, so that ends the trial, ends the case. However, we can still push for an inquiry, we can still push for a Royal Commission so that this doesn't happen to any more families and the injustice that we've seen. So that's the answers, and thank you for these questions, they were very good.
So I think one, just I guess from the context of the local community, was there backlash towards the Native communities after the Gerald Stanley trial? In the ending of the documentary, you saw Tasha's crews recorded the trucks that were circling the courthouse. that sort of show of force is kind of normal in the Battlefords area and in rural Sask, where there is definitely, in some cases, an intimidation factor from young males, teenagers all the way up to about 40, even more than that. But really the Gerald Stanley trial did stimulate a lot of conversations that really motivated far-right white supremacy narratives that we're seeing flare up on social media, where there should be a right to defend our land, where there should be a right to defend our property, where there should be a right to acquire arms, and this whole far-right sort of leaning narrative that's emerging all around the world is also showing up in rural Saskatchewan. They're all on the same forums. They're all on the same, Reddit forums talking about these political theories and things like that. And it really did fuel this certain narrative that isn't really in hiding anymore. That's sort of just visible and present. And if you talk to somebody about politics, you look at Alberta, you look at the conversations taken there with the UCP government and Kenny, there's a lot of people who openly support that, who probably were jumping happily for the Gerald Stanley trial. So there is still this very open sort of political and economic paradigm that seeks to eradicate and remove Indigenous people, that they want the right to intimidate and put us in our place. There was a little solidarity blockade in Saskatoon, and there was some counter-protesters that showed up just a few weeks ago, and a lot of them, they brought up, there came to scold these youth who decided to put up a little solidarity blockade with Wet'suwet'en people in BC next to the rail line in the inner city Saskatoon. And they really mobilized in a very unique way where the CP rail allowed them to stay there. They didn't arrest them or anything, and they held that space for 4 days. But on the first day, there was a counter-protesters that showed up that were far-right sort of extremists in some cases, because they were literally bringing up the Gerald Stanley trial to these young Native activists who were occupying that space, saying some very vulgar things to these young people. So there is still backlash. There was backlash, and there is still backlash, because that verdict literally was almost like a dog whistle for a lot of people to say, hey, it's okay. We could have these narratives and the legal systems in play to protect us in some cases. So I have to be very mindful of that. Once you see it and turn the lights on some of these dynamics and these observations, it's impossible to shut them off again. You'll see them, you'll notice it, you'll hear it when you hear it. And that's what they refer to as dog whistles in some cases, that it's sort of like an unspoken code that white supremacy, far-right economic and political philosophy and control over Indigenous lands and peoples is the way to go. And it's really unfair and unjust. And it's out there now. It's out there. People are having open conversations like this about us. So. Thank you.
So the question I chose to respond to was, what are some things allies can do to change or end racism? And I think being here tonight, engaging in your own learning, there's so much materials available to learn about the history of Indigenous people, the history of Indigenous settler relations. I believe that National Film Board has many films that are now available free and open access. I think that there's more education needed, more critical kinds of education. In the inquiry into the freezing death of Neil Stonechild, 17-year-old First Nations found frozen to death on the edge of the city of Saskatoon in 1990. Eventually, after 2 additional men in 2000 were found frozen to death, and then a third one who lived to walk back and tell the story of how the Saskatoon Police Service had taken him out there. There was this inquiry, and one of the recommendations for that inquiry was that the police service needed cross-cultural awareness training program. And I really have, I thought about that, and the 2 men who died, who froze to death on the edge of the city, were both, they all spoke English. So there wouldn't have been an opportunity for like cultural misunderstanding. Daryl, who lived to walk back, spoke English. And so I think that has been my observation, that when we have this racial conflict, we end up having our institutions recommend cultural awareness training program. And I would argue that we need anti-racist education. For the police service, but because racism kills. It keeps killing over and over again. And you see that not only in the legal system, but also in the medical system. And so the College of Nursing still does not have an anti-racist education, even though there are organizations that are starting to collect the data on the ways in which Indigenous people are mistreated within the healthcare system. And so we have the legal system, the medical system, the educational system, social services system. And so we really are in need of education. And I've been working in the faculty of education at the U of S since 1992. I, 20 years ago, developed an anti-racist education course at the graduate level. I've been teaching at the undergraduate level since then. But at the graduate level, year after year, and to much of my dismay, that course is an optional course. It's like an elective. It's not a required course for students who come in at the graduate level to do educational administration, curriculum development, ed psychology, testing and assessment, special ed. And so even in my own college, there's still a reluctance to acknowledge the need for critical race analysis. And we see decade after decade, or year after year, or every 4 years, some tragedy that unfolds that continues to be evidence of the need for education. And so allies advocate for education, for critical anti-racist education, and engage in your own process of learning. At this point in time, there is so much excellent material that's available on the internet. And I've been helping the Meadow Lake Tribal Council in developing their understanding of anti-racism, just by sending materials up to them that are open access, widely available. So I encourage you to engage in your own, like, self-directed learning. Thank you.
I'm just going to add to what Verna said. So I think that we need to engage in our own education, but we also need to advocate for systemic change. And that's really important, because just learning doesn't necessarily mean change is going to happen. And that connects to one of I have very legal questions, and I'm not a legal expert, so if Eleanor wants to add to what I'm going to speak to them, then she's welcome to. So one of my questions is, do you think that the justice system will change? And all I can give to that is, it's only going to change if we talk to politicians. We need to talk to them, because they actually need to care. And that's the only way that it's going to change. We have to advocate. So that would be my only response to that. I mean, do I hope that it will change? Of course I do. But it will not change unless we are willing to say, this is not right. The rates of incarceration for adult women and men and boys and girls in Saskatchewan is ridiculously high for Indigenous people. And then the other question I have, and I think that Eleanor has actually kind of answered it, is, could an Indigenous hunter give his testimony on gun safety, hang fires, firing a gun. And she's already spoken to the idea of lay people giving testimony. So I think that a lawyer could invite an Indigenous hunter as a lay witness, but that's all that testimony would count as. Is that right, Eleanor? I'm gonna hand this back to you.
Oh, the Indigenous hunter question. In theory, anybody could be called up to testify, but if it's in any trial, there's of course expert witnesses who have expertise. Like he was talking about the officer Williams who testified in the Stanley trial. He was a gun expert. He had a degree in physics, right? Yeah, physics, and that was what he did at the RCMP depot. He tested guns and he taught firearms courses. That's an expert. So in a trial, there are sometimes experts called, and in theory, anybody could be called as a witness. But I don't think that in this trial, either party would have called an Indigenous witness to testify, just the way that it went, and the biases and the stereotypes that were present. I don't think that either side would have been open to calling an Indigenous hunter.
For the sake of time, we've noticed some of our students have already left. They've had to travel back to Stanley Mission and Grandmother's Bay. I want to thank the chaperones that are going to bring them over, the staff members, and one of our counselors has also brought some students from Grandmother's Bay. So what we want to do is just, again, give everybody a big round of applause up here. On behalf of Churchill Community School, thank you to the principal up there, thank you, and to the staff that are hosting us, thank you very much. And we're gonna have in closing, we're gonna have a song. Kennetch is gonna do a prayer song as a thank you, but if you have any further questions, our guests will be up here. And if you don't, then we wish you safe travels and a good night to your home fires.
Just in closing, such a very tough topic. But one of the teachings that I've hung on to for myself for a long time is that we are all children of the Creator. And I think one of the greatest lessons we have to learn is that we're one big family, no matter where you live in this world. And at some point, we look at our humanness, the good and the bad. And when we think about what's going to guide us, our time here on this earth is short. What's the living age now, about 80? 80 years to figure it out. And there's a place that we can go to figure that out. I often thought, where does racism come from? Gee whiz, somebody had to really think about that. You're white, you're brown. Yeah, so? You got all these human beings all over the earth. And I think about how many beautiful people are out there who are trying to figure this out, who have gone the journey inside to their hearts and have seen that. Reaching out to the many to wake up to our humanness, to wake up to our career. And you know what? It doesn't even matter if you don't believe in God. I saw this in a movie. Because why? God believes in you. So you're here. And you know what? I have that hope. I have that hope that we're all going to wake up. I have that hope that we have a future. Because I know I love my children. And I know you love your children too. And I know Creator loves us because you are all His children. Here's no, kagid ba kita ko sini. Ako minay isagi na kagid. Hi hi.
Thank you very much. Everybody have a good night, safe travels, and a special thank you again to everybody.